Hello, everyone. It's noon here in Minneapolis, so I will say good morning or good afternoon or happy noon to you, depending on where you are in the country. I'm Laura Bloomberg. I'm the Dean of the Humphrey School of Public Affairs, and I'm really delighted that you're joining us for this webinar as part of our Humphrey School Summer Seminar Series. Last week, we kicked off the summer-long series, and I'm really thrilled that so many of you are back to join us again this week. On our website, you will see a whole lineup of seminars for the next several weeks, and check back often as the seminars for August become posted. You'll be able to see those there as well. Today's seminar is titled From Equity to Social Justice, Reimagining City Planning After the Protests. It obviously is a tragically timely topic for cities all over this country, and it highlights the expertise of our faculty and alumni in our Masters of Urban and Regional Planning area. Our panel today includes Associate Professor Ryan Allen, who is also chair of our Urban and Regional Planning area, Assistant Professor Fernando Burga, and 2018 MURP graduate Denetrick Powers. Thank you all for being with us. I'm excited to hear your insights and what you have to say today as panelists. I'll now turn it over to our moderator, LisaBeth Barajas, who graduated from the Humphrey School in 2004 and currently serves as the Community Development Director for the Metropolitan Council here in the Twin Cities. Lisa, over to you.
Thank you, Laura. I'm LisaBeth Barajas, and I'm happy to moderate this panel today with my esteemed colleagues here. And before we get in, perhaps I'll have each of my colleagues just talk give some brief remarks about their background, history, and their affiliation with the Humphrey. So perhaps maybe we'll have Denetrick start us off.
Thank you, LisaBeth. Hi, everybody. My name is Denetrick Powers. I'm currently the Director of Planning and Engagement for NAO Partners, which is the strategic real estate advisory and urban planning firm. I'm born and raised here in the Twin Cities. I predominantly grew up in North Minneapolis, attended North High, so I am a Polar. My background is in creative placemaking and community organizing. I'm a practicing artist myself, particularly a writer, a poet, as well as photography. Did some organizing in the North Minneapolis area around transit-oriented development, specifically around the Blue Line Extension and Southwest Extension. And that's what led me to, urban planning, just having an innate curiosity to, my environment around me.
Thank you, Denetrick. Fernando, could you provide some remarks about yourself?
Certainly, it's great to be here with all of you. I am an assistant professor at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs in a MURP program. I teach land use and site planning. Also going to teach a new class on food systems. I am not from Minnesota. I am from Lima, Peru, but grew up in Miami, Florida, then went to school at UC Berkeley and have been here for the past 5 years. My research, teaching, and service focuses on the intersection of equity and urban planning with a specific focus on Latino immigrants and food systems. I love Minnesota. I'm learning how to be here as a person of color, and I'm going to share my experiences about that. Certainly, there's a lot of work to be done, but it's also a privilege to be here with all of you. And I'm invested in a lot of different community projects within the region that look at food systems and also equity in urban planning.
Thank you. And rounding us out, Ryan.
Thanks, Lisa. Hi, everybody. My name is Ryan Allen. As Dean Bloomberg remarked, I'm a faculty member in the Urban and Regional Planning program, and I chair our program there. I've been here for over a dozen years now, and like Fernando, I'm getting used to what it means to be in the Midwest, having come from North Carolina and more immediately in the Boston area for graduate school. My area of research and teaching is in planning theory, but also housing and community development with a focus on immigrant communities for much of my research. In addition to performing research and teaching, I've also been involved in some legal cases that are relevant to planning, specifically at housing and immigrant communities where I have the privilege of being part of a legal team that's suing the Department of Homeland Security. So without further ado, I'm eager to get into the conversation, so I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ryan, and thank you, everybody. And just a little bit about myself. Laura did note I was the Community Development Director at the Metropolitan Council. I've been with the council for over a dozen years now, and got my graduate degree at the Humphrey. I focused on natural resource management and recreational resource management. And from my perspective as a Mexican American about what it means for people of color to access those resources and to have communities, neighborhoods that have those resources for them as well. Being someone, and I could speak to this a little bit later in our conversation, but having grown up in a neighborhood myself that lacked those resources, it's something that's very near and dear to my heart. So that brought me all over the state of Minnesota doing planning before I landed at the council. So let's start off with a really important topic, and I think a topic that we've been remiss as a profession to not speak on as frequently and as candidly as we should, and I'm looking forward to this conversation today. For our listeners today, you'll note there is a Q&A at the bottom too. We'll be having a moderated discussion, and then I'll be checking Q&A along the way, but more specifically near the end of our conversation today, and get to as many of those questions as we can. So to start us off, I think I want to ask each of our panelists about what you see as the current ideology that underpins the field of planning and how it relates to our topic of moving from equity to social justice. Does anyone want to kick us off first? How about Fernando? I'll start with you.
Thank you. So actually, to begin, I'm not going to answer that question. I'm going to, sorry, Lisa. I'm actually going to call out a number of organizations that are doing amazing work on the ground. And I'm doing this in order to guide the audience towards the support of those organizations. These are groups that have been active way before the events that are shaking us right now. And they have been looking at issues that have to do with white supremacy and urban planning in policy systems in the police, as well as other issues that impact communities of color in Minnesota for many years. I'm gonna name them so that we're all aware of them. They are MPD 150, Black Visions Collective, Unicorn Riot, Minnesota Women for Political Change, Parks and Power, Reclaim the Block, Centro de Trabajadores Unidos en la Lucha, CETUL, Pimento Kitchen, Appetite for Change, West Broadway Area and Business Coalition, Juxtaposition Arts, Lake Street Council, La Escuelita, and Enquilinekis Unidekis. These are organizations that are really a very small selection. I'm sure that many of you in this call know many others, but I want to point them out. It is important to be able to support them as much as we join these webinars to be able to think through these issues. Now to answer the question, my notion of the underlying ideology of urban planning is white supremacy. This is a notion that I believe is embedded in the systems that define urban planning, and I'm thinking of transportation, parks, housing, land use, and some also emergent systems such as education and food access, which are becoming more predominant. There have been many scholars, activists, advocates on the ground that have been looking at this question for years. And now we're starting to become much more aware of this. Certainly, this is a really tough category and difficult issue to think about, especially for white people who are becoming aware of the different aspects of their lives that are informed of white supremacy. But it is something that we must recognize, and I believe now is the right time to start putting that category as a central category in the work of advocacy, scholarship, and practice of urban planning.
Thank you, Fernando. Would Ryan or Denetrick want to add their thoughts on this question?
Denetrick, why don't you go first?
Yep. Thank you, Fernando, for naming all of those organizations. I mean, I think everybody that was on this call, and if they weren't, they should have been thinking that the answer was white supremacy. You know, I often, forget about yesterday when we were having this conversation, amongst us. I had said, capitalism, and I said that because I was specifically thinking the way that urban planning facilitates the distribution of resources, and more specifically, the distribution of value amongst certain groups of people. I mean, in the current context, with the killing of George Floyd, that is an issue with the police. But if we think about why the police are even exist in this day, it's to commit violence against those who are a risk or a threat to the wealthy, or a threat to those in power, who happen to be white supremacists.
Thanks for sharing, Denetrick. Ryan, did you want to add on or provide
Yeah,
a different
I'd be
view?
happy to. And I too want to echo the thanks that Denetrick gave to Fernando. I think it's important to acknowledge all of those institutions and many others that we could spend time talking about as well. I'm gonna use some Marxist terms to describe what I think of as the ideological underpinnings of planning. And what we learn from scholars of Marx in the field of planning is that one way of understanding the ideology of planning is to understand it as promoting and replicating and reinforcing the status quo. That is, kind of replicating social norms and relationships and the political and economic relationships that underpin those social relationships. Social reproduction is the term that Marx used to describe this. And I think we can see planning playing a prominent role, not just today, but in history, with that same kind of ideological underpinning, all the way from codified racialized zoning, which was really quite specific and deliberate in its attempt to segregate by race, to sundown towns, to racial covenants, to redlining, to the large federally sponsored urban renewal program, investments in transportation infrastructure, exclusionary zoning that still exists today and has been reinforced in many communities. All of that is part and parcel of what planning has been and what it is today, and how it tends to replicate, reinforce, and in some cases, I would offer in many cases, exacerbate existing disparities that exist along racial lines in the United States. And historical lens indicates that this is, of course, not a new phenomenon, that this is, if not decades, centuries old in the United States. The historical record indicates that 50 years ago, when the Kerner Commission yielded its findings about the rebellions and riots that occurred in the 60s, the grievances that they uncovered and described in that report could just have easily been written this past week. And in addition to police brutality, they singled out things like inadequate housing, inadequate public infrastructures and investments, inadequate schools, and limited economic opportunity. And that is obviously still paramount in American cities and suburbs and beyond today. So when I think of the ideology of planning, I agree with my colleagues. It is certainly one of white supremacy. It is certainly one of reinforcing economic systems that favor whites over blacks, and it is unfortunately, I think, very entrenched. And I think part of our goal here today is begin a conversation about what do you do with that entrenchment. So those are my thoughts. But Lisa, I want to make sure you are not just the moderator. You have more experience on the ground than many of us, and so I would love to hear your thoughts too.
Absolutely, and I think I echo a lot of what you've said, especially around the idea of the exchange value, the capitalist system that we are dealing with. The property rights, we're told right away, right, as part of our degrees, of our education, that property rights are the underpinning. This is how the foundation of how we do planning, who has rights to what that bundle is. But if you never owned property, then you have no rights. And of course, who doesn't own property in this nation? It's not the white people. So all of that leads me to the question that I want to pose back to Denetrick as a recent a graduate, and to Fernando as a person of color, knowing that the system was built to essentially perpetuate the white supremacy. How do you navigate your career? How do you navigate within the system? And kind of how do you see your role in that, either as a part of that, or as changing that, or both?
Denetrick, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I can go first. Being a couple of years removed from grad school, I'm still figuring out how to navigate my career. But let me just say this, is that, this urban planning isn't just a career for me. It was a life choice. It was a choice that I made even when I came, to the, to the Humphrey. I came to the Humphrey because this was something that I felt like I needed to learn to survive myself, but I also think other people that came from my community also needed to learn in order for them to survive and to thrive. For me, the biggest thing, I navigate my career, my life by relationships. Taking care of those relationships that take care of me. Specifically, even still staying in touch with Fernando, who was a big part of the reason why I kept my fire going, throughout the time that I was at the Humphrey. Oftentimes when, I speak to people about my Humphrey experience, I joke with them that, I was trying to start fires, and I was, on purpose. I was very angry. There was often times where I felt like I wasn't being heard, or I wasn't being, I was just being ignored. Like, I was being heard, but there was times where even if someone didn't have the answer, instead of admitting that they didn't have the answer, then they just ignored it, which is one of the issues that you see in urban planning, specifically in community engagement. Instead of saying, I don't know the answer, but here's what I do know, and here's how you could possibly figure it out based on the tools that that's what I have. We just ignore the community, and people are just getting tired of being ignored. So I'm going to continue navigating my career by, taking care of relationships to take care of me, allow myself to thrive and flourish in rooms that allow me the space to actually, speak up. And, the rooms that, ignore me, I'm going to evaluate, is it worth my time? Because sometimes it isn't, worth my time, because there's way too many people in the world, too many possibilities and opportunities to be worried about what 3 or 4 or 5 people in a room, are doing. Or not.
Thanks, Denetrick. And now I think that's really important. I understand that being early in your career, there's a lot that you're still figuring out too. I remember being there and kind of having all of this lived experience and knowledge with you. I found myself in a different place when I was starting my career, because would say folks would really tiptoe around the question altogether, and it was only me by myself and doubting whether my experiences were real or only in my head, because there was no one to affirm them for me. I was one of few students of color in my graduating class in the planning degree, and working in rural Minnesota, one of few professionals that I could engage with as a person of color. So I'm somewhat envious of your position, Denetrick, today, of having a community that you can speak with, especially navigating your career earlier. But I'm also, I would say, optimistic about finally having this conversation rather than kind of beating around the bush about what we know to be true in this system. But I do want to hear from Fernando on this question as well.
That's a really deep and personal question, and I think Denetrick has answered in a very elegant and precise way. I think my experience is as complex as Denetrick's. I find myself in a privileged position, being an assistant professor in a recognized institution. At the same time, I still navigate and, imagine and have to reimagine every day what is my role in urban planning, or what is my place in planning academia. I mean, this is a question that I think about at least 3 times every day. When I think others don't, and that also brings confusion and complexity to the choice and the choices I make in the future. I think that living in Minnesota as a person of color is amazing. So I have great respect for Denetrick, who has actually taught me a lot. I just want to plug that for Denetrick, because he is my professor of the city in many ways. And I have learned and continue to learn from him in ways that are deeply impactful and insightful. But being a person of color coming to Minnesota it's an experience unto itself. I grew up in places in which people spoke Spanish openly in public, and that would not work against your social capital. In fact, it gave you social capital. I worked in Washington, D.C., which was a very international multicultural city. And then I went to school at UC Berkeley, which is a West Coast city where there's a deep influence of the Chicano community, right? So coming to Minnesota is different, because I think people of color and minorities find themselves, in a sense, surrounded by the white gaze, and also the projections of white liberal imagination, right? And the place and the capacities and limits of what minorities represent. So I think it's a question of numbers, it's a question of power, it's a question of who is elected, it's a question of the representations that surround us and tell us that we belong and not. And that definitely goes beyond just what the comprehensive planning does or says. But certainly it is about urbanism. Certainly it is about the use value, right, versus the exchange value of the city that defines land uses and all these other norms. And having come here and been here for a while, I always joke, I never thought white people would be so interesting. And I say that because I also recognize and see the complexity and diversity in the experience of whiteness being here, moving through this very difficult space, right? And that opens a lot of difficult, tough questions for people of color, especially in planning and policy systems work, which is like, how do we remake these things? How do we create new bonds and relationships, right? How do we think about allyship or becoming accomplices, right? How do we think beyond just the usual toolkits and keywords that define racial awareness, when some white people are just now starting to become aware of their racial and white privilege, right? So these are really tough and interesting questions, I think.
I just want to speak on
Sure.
notion of, you had mentioned social capital and, the risk of, losing that social capital. If you are open with, who you are culturally. I think that it's important, and I challenge everybody on this call to, to redefine, how they think about risk. And I say that because, we often think about risk, especially in kind of these corporate academic settings, of losing social capital or gaining social capital. And we let that dictate how we navigate our careers, but instead of looking at it in terms of, cost or benefit, lost and gaining something, like what can we think of it in terms of, what can we learn? Based on what I already know, what can I learn, if I take this new risk and apply it to my career that I have now, yes, I believe that white people have a difficult identity challenge that I don't quite understand. It looks weird to me sometimes. But I'm still trying to understand it. But I think a lot of my white peers, I can see it in their face that they're evaluating the risk of supporting me, supporting their Black peers, supporting their Black friends, taking the risk of, working in the community and, standing by what the community says that they want, because they're afraid of losing their job. They're afraid of, not gaining that promotion. Why not take that risk anyways and learn and educate yourself on how now you see, now you can see how white supremacy is not only, keeping, people of color and, below the kind of, at the bottom of the social pillar, but also how it's, keeping you as a white person, in this kind of social box.
Thanks for bringing that up, Denetrick. I think that's a really great segue into the next question I want to ask. And we talked about this when we were preparing for this conversation too, about that risk mitigation and how so much of planning is centered around public investment risk mitigation and cost benefit analyses, and it doesn't really center the experiences and voices of the people. It's really a dollar and cents exercise. And so I want to, I've seen that as an obstacle in our work and in trying to achieve social justice outcomes, but I'd like to hear from you all about what other obstacles or challenges do you see about our current kind of planning ideology and actually achieving social justice?
I think the first challenge is how we measure impact. Like, that's the first challenge. I'm reading one of the questions in the Q&A right now, and Adam Brandt asks, how would you measure social capital? If that's the best way to measure white privilege, and then how would you redistribute social capital fairly? That question, when I read that, makes me uncomfortable at first. Just because I know so many, my gut is telling me that people will first jump to like this quantitative formula about how to measure, white privilege and white and social capital. And, I can just say that I wouldn't know how to, it's an internal measurement that I have with myself, about the social capital, how I measure whether or not I have a wealth of social capital or lack, social capital, but it begins with me and how those people that I surround myself make me feel. So how we approach measurement is a big challenge to, moving towards social justice and urban planning, because everything is so quantitative. I mean, when I first, I don't know if Ryan remembers this conversation, when he came and spoke to me at the Harrison Neighborhood Association to give me the news that, I originally wasn't accepted to the Humphrey. And it was because my math scores for the ACT, they could have been better. And they wanted me, the suggestion was that I go to, community college for the summer, take the test again, and then reapply, for the following year. And I'm like math, that's what's gonna hold me back from, that's gonna be my hurdle towards going to school. Like, I'm not coming here to necessarily get a degree. I appreciate the degree. I won't downplay it. It does offer me a privilege that others don't. But if we keep, having these quantitative hurdles, for people have to, get over, whether that's math, whether that's being able to understand statistics, and I hate statistics. You learn
I'm with you.
in the first couple of weeks that it ain't real. It's all relative. So what does that really mean?
I have a response, if I could, Lisa, to the question.
Please.
I think that so the question, as I understand it, is what are the barriers in place for moving planning to a place of seeking social justice rather than a focus on equity or even less, right? And so as I shared with you all yesterday as we were discussing this, I believe one of the major barriers in place is the complete, in my opinion, inadequacy of the tools that we imagine we have at our disposal as planners, given the crisis in front of us. And this may sound trite, but we respond to racial disparities on, for example, in the New York Times this morning, a piece that examined research showing that, that the racial disparity in earnings for Black and white men has been constant from 1950 to now, right? And if you think about the legal changes and the civil rights movement and everything that's occurred since the 50s, and to know that the economic outcome is unchanged, that kind of deep and persistent disparity, and we respond to that with offering triplexes in the city of Minneapolis. And I don't mean that to downplay how difficult it was to pass a comprehensive plan that did away with single family zoning, and many other things that exist in that plan, right? But I do believe that if we are serious about moving to social justice, we're not going to be able to nibble around the edges. That if we are going to rely on that kind of strategy, then we're going to be mired hopelessly, in my opinion, in trying to change dramatic societal problems. And so for what that means for me is that we have to completely reimagine and re-empower what planning could be. And that I'm not Pollyannish about. I understand that there are real political and economic barriers to planning changing. We don't exist in a vacuum. We have city councils and state legislatures and Congress and a variety of other important institutions that we have to work through. But when I think about the change that's needed, it's eliminating single family zoning as a start and then rapidly progressing into a social movement and contributing to a social movement that ultimately makes reparations a centerpiece. That may seem far afield for some people from what planning is and does, and I think that's part of the problem. It shouldn't be. I mean, if we're going to imagine a new beginning for what our society can be, I believe it has to be predicated on economic advantage and equality, not just the promise of being able to get a job, but the actual delivery of having economic opportunity across racial boundaries, which is currently not the case. And so there are things that we can and should do as planners. Like we should be much more insightful and impactful in how we're treating economic development. We should and we can increase how much we're focusing on affordable housing issues. But those are going to lead to really marginal changes, and the larger changes are what's needed here. And people have said that, I've seen commentators say that they think of this as somehow this is different this time, that the protests were more widespread, that they were multiracial, that we believe we can accomplish this. And I guess I'm cautiously optimistic, but history is not very supportive of that idea. And so I think we have to acknowledge that, and that should make us not throw our hands up, but it should make us double down. So those are some of my thoughts on that, and I don't want to take more time.
Sure.
I want to hear the other respondents.
Absolutely. Thanks, Ryan. I think those are really good points, and I agree that there is a role for planning to play, and I think I've heard often from planners are like, well, that's not us, right? That's criminal justice reform. That's not what we do. Or that's the banks. We can't control them. Or that's someone else. And so while there are changes that planning can do and can impact, I think what I've often heard from others in the field is that, well, it's just the margins. Therefore, we shouldn't really focus on it. But I also recognize, and I think we all recognize here, that planning has played the large role of setting the foundation. It's easy. Once you segregate people, it's easy to decide who gets what resources because you've got them in buckets everywhere. You can separate them from jobs, and you can separate them from schools, and you can make it easy for people to limit are to have limited access to the things they need to have full and complete lives and full and complete, potential to actually realize. But I want to hear from Fernando on what you think about obstacles and challenges to our current planning ideologies and achieving social justice.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm gonna pivot back to some of the statements that Denetrick has made and also connect to Ryan. The first thing is this, crisis of measurement, which underlies what we are currently undergoing, sheds light on some of the complexities and contradictions of planning, right? So, I like to think that the 20th century was male and quantitative, and the 21st century is female and qualitative. Now, I don't want to be dichotomous or gender with that statement. It's reductive. But what I'm trying to say is that there is a dire need, I think, as Denetrick and Ryan have pointed out, that we need to reassess what we measure, right? And not everything that is measured matters, and neither is everything that matters capable of being measured either, right? So we struggle with that. One of the things that is fascinating to me, just looking at planning in the Twin Cities, is that we're very good in Minnesota and in the Twin Cities are identifying the gaps and disenfranchisement that people of color have experienced, right? And this is done demographically through rational planning approaches, upper level aggregate analysis, which is how arguably we teach here at the Humphrey, right, in many ways. So we're part of this social reproduction, as Ryan points out at the beginning, right? But ultimately, the questions that are happening and changing and are challenging us are things that are happening on the ground, right? Or they're happening in relationships that are being built in Harrison, for example, as Denetrick points out, right? There is this tension between the fixed nature of the comprehensive plan and the aggregate demographic analysis based on census data and analysis that places and identifies people of color in this city as pathological spaces, spaces of emergency, spaces of exception, versus all the thriving practices, ideas, and innovations that are going on in these locations that are not legible to urban planning practice, right? Because ultimately we rely on the demographic data to tell us what to do, right? So this is a really interesting tension for me. How do we move from the fixed nature of planning, the fixity of the land use category of the comprehensive plan and its categories, to the relational space, right, of people's practices in the city and what they're doing right now in terms of food systems, in terms of addressing homelessness, in terms of addressing all kinds of issues that are not in the plan, that are not things we can measure through census data, that are not things that necessarily will give us the whys and the hows and drive us towards immediate action, but will only tell us the same thing that we always know, that things are not working. And by the way, that's where they're not working, right? And that informs our imaginary of where failure exists, right? So this is a contradiction, right? We see it in the comprehensive plans. We see it in the way that we do our teaching service and scholarship. It is necessary, but at the same time, I don't think we pay enough attention or give enough precedence to other forms of measuring and other forms of knowledge, which could also change the way we do this, right? And just to seal this, I would argue that this crisis of measurement actually reifies whiteness and reproduces white supremacy, because in my opinion, this is my own bias as a person of color in Minnesota, the numbers actually serve to paralyze white people from actually doing the hard, difficult, tough work of going there, of going to what Denetrick has mentioned and underlined, taking the risk to go beyond the census data, taking the risk to go beyond the demographic analysis, to actually build the relationships, observe and understand the practices so that we can reimagine how we do policy work and planning. That's the challenge.
So building off of that string and related to a couple of questions that I got in the chat and in the email, there's a lot of conversation about engagement, right? How do we actually engage with communities all across our region? How do we engage with folks with different backgrounds and social status to actually make change, to harness the momentum and energy that Ryan, I think you said, is folks are saying are maybe is different than it has been in the past? How do we actually make it different this time and take advantage of our current events and energies to actually make some changes, both in the planning profession itself and how planners engage, doing, Fernando, what you were talking about in education and in the practice. I know I don't think any of us really have answers, but really have lots of thoughts, and I don't want to profess to our audience listening that we've got it solved. But I think that this panel today has really been thinking about how we do that, and probably we might come out with more questions than answers.
Can you summarize the question one more time for me?
Sure. So how do we kind of use the energy and momentum of the protests and the George Floyd's murder to actually make changes in the planning profession, in planning practice, in our education systems to get towards the social justice that we're seeking?
I have a couple of ideas about that, so perhaps I can start while others are thinking through it. I think there's actually a potentially large role that planning can play in that, right? And so to Fernando's point about going there, right, and going past the higher level aggregate census numbers, I think in my experience, the most effective planners are those that have deep, trusted relationships in community and are of community, right? And that's true if you're sitting in the planning office in City Hall, or you're working as an advocate at a nonprofit, right? That the commonality in being effective in your job, I think, is in having strong, deep relationships that are trusted in the community. And the unfortunate reality is that many planners don't ever establish those, right? The many planners parachute in when they are doing a comp plan. They do a cursory kind of participatory activity and call it a day. And I think many of us acknowledge that that is clearly insufficient. The challenge, I think, or one of the additional challenges I would name here is in having the resources and time to actually go about creating those relationships. Because I have sympathy for planners that feel pulled in a million directions and are working in a large geographic scope. How do you make those kinds of choices when there are only so many hours in the day? And so that, to me, speaks for greater investment in time and energy and larger staffs, right? I mean, I think that because planners sit at the intersection of a lot of these complex systems of oppression, right? Think real estate, transportation, the land use system, all of those systems, planning sits at the intersection of them, right? And therefore is both culpable in a lot of the problems that they create, but also has the potential to be a leader in solving some of those problems, right? And so those are some of my thoughts on the question. I mean, I think we have to really be much more intentional about the kinds of relationships that we create and relationships that we nurture that come well before the call for participation, right? That kind of extractive call. It can't be that. It has to go much, much deeper.
For sure, that was definitely my experience as a planner in local government, and especially in small towns where it was only considered part-time staff or consulting staff, so only really to process permits and to help develop plans and ordinances. But the real work of understanding and planning for a community is knowing the community. And you can't know the community if you're not allowed to be in the community. And I think many of our, this is not uncommon practice, but it is quite common for your staff planners to not have the time or capacity to even write the plan for their community, but to have to hire consultants to do that. In the class I teach at the Humphrey, the capstone on public engagement in planning and policy making, really emphasize the importance of the relationship. You can't develop policy for people unless you're doing it with people. You can't understand that policy and the impact locally unless you actually understand who is impacted by it and their experiences with it. And the relationship takes time to build, and the knowledge and deep understanding takes time. It can't be transactional. But planning as a profession, especially in practice, has been set up to be very transactional. Process the permit, build the building, write the plan, period. So much so that most of our families don't actually know what we do. But I'd like to hear from others on that. What do you think about what needs to change in this? How can we capture the energy today to make real change, whether it's in the education? There's been a lot of questions in the chat here about education in particular, but maybe Fernando wants to speak to that, but I also like to hear from Denetrick around what you think in the profession we can take advantage of the current energy and momentum to make some lasting change.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, the education question is a very special one for me. You know, I'll be honest with you. It's a very confusing answer. I don't want to say that there is just lack of clarity. I think that planning has many different dimensions of pedagogy, right? And because we're such a diverse discipline, there is also a lot of difference in ways of seeing and understanding cities and rural areas, right? So the pedagogy question is a fascinating one. I think personally, I've leaned towards doing projects with students that are very complex and challenging and iterative, which actually challenge students to their core. And some students don't like that, actually. And that is also very challenging as an experience. But, I think that personally, I do not know how to do planning otherwise, right? I've publicly said and repeat, I don't necessarily believe in tests or reports, right? And that's my own bias from my own background, because like Denetrick, I was also bad at math, and yet I find myself here working in an institution that has opened the doors for me to be able to do this wonderful work. So I think that as planners in academia, we have to learn how to be able to, once again, identify those other ways to represent data, those other ways to gear knowledge, and those other ways to know how to place those quote unquote findings with folks on the ground who can use those things for their particular notions, right? We think very much about the comprehensive plan as the ultimate outcome of what we do. And I have to give a plug to CPED planners, because their comprehensive plan is excellent in the way that they've captured language, statistics, and framings to think about triplexes and also push us forward, right, in thinking about planning, perhaps towards reparation, as Ryan says. But at the same time, we also need to think about counter-planning. We have to think about tactics. We need to think about planning as not this, this large document, but something that is discrete, provisional, temporary, something that involves relationships, something that may be on the ground, which appears and disappears, and also has a very lasting impact. I consider, how do we understand, how do we plan for George Floyd's memorial? How do we make sense of that space in our work? that space will remain permanent in our lives forever. That's a sacred and profane space at the same time, which is magical in its expression. How do we think of the emergency food access points that are sprouting all over Lake Street and West Broadway? How do we think of the self-help housing efforts and encampments that are going on Powderhorn Park? What do we do with those experiences, and how does the comprehensive plan actually address them, right? So we don't have languages, we don't have tools, we don't have ways of seeing and visibilities to be able to truly grasp that experience of the city. And I would argue those experiences of the city are going to become more permanent. They're going to become more of the status quo. So how do we rethink planning towards those experiences is what I'm interested in teaching and thinking about.
Thank you. And I know that's a big question, and scrolling through the chat, there are a lot of questions about the Humphrey School's curriculum and practices and their role in planning, and perhaps seeing that we're nearing the end of our hour here, perhaps Ryan and Fernando would like to follow up with some of those questions, and we'll do that with all these questions. But I want to get to another topic in here that I think is related to a comment I had made earlier about kind of the, but this is an issue that is for the criminal justice, or this is a banking issue and not a planning issue. But perhaps we want to speak a little bit more specifically about banks and financial institutions and how they relate to planning and how they see risk, and maybe not help community to achieve the vision that they have set forth in their plans, or even in their short-term plans to want to address. And I know perhaps Denetrick has a little more experience with development on the ground than some of us, but I'd like to hear from all of you about how you see the planner's relationship with financial institutions and actually achieving that community vision.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to try to touch on the banks, the schools, community engagement, curriculum, and using the momentum for all of that as best as I can. I think that, first of all, we have to make room for that momentum to keep going. And you make room for it by not isolating it to a local Minnesota, Minneapolis issue, but realizing that this momentum has reached worldwide, and that there are people all over the world who are recognizing this and who are, ready to organize, where they are, in order to support. People are supporting each other all across the nation and the world right now, in many ways. I think right now one of the things that that the Humphrey could do is, start training your planners to be organizers. Not organizers, not mobilizers. This ain't get out to vote efforts. We're talking about actually getting people, building relationships, developing leaders, developing people's capacity to be able to lead themselves and acting as a resource and a facilitator, amongst multiple different stakeholders. Being somebody who's going to come in the room and ask questions, instead of always having the answer. Do that by, right now you have all of these, community members that are organizing food drives, resource drives, who are taking care of each other when the city is doing whatever the city's doing, trying to figure out whatever it is that they're going to do, because they don't know either. But the city, people ain't waiting on the city. They're not waiting on policy to be created. They're always getting it done. That's what these poor communities have always done. That's what people who want change, they go and make change. They're not waiting on the city or waiting for policy to change. So, start training our students, have the same way that, I'm going to assume that the same way that professors make tenure, or, doctoral students, become doctors, make those students be peer reviewed by people in the community. I mean, those are their peers. You know, they're not above them. You know, nor the community is not below them. The community should be able to say, you know what, that person may not make the best planner, and here's why. You know, let's think about how there needs to be more perspectives in the planning curriculum. You know, one of the things that, you know, I did, you know, after my first year was, you know, like I was researching other, like I was reading this stuff and I'm like, cool. I get this is, you know, it's broadening my perspective on one side of the issue. But then I started realizing that all of the whole planning curriculum has just been reactive to the movement of Black people. It's like wherever Black people go, that's like, now we need a whole new planning strategy. We need a whole new policy. You know, so like we need new perspectives. There are Black planners. There are people that are thinking about planning and ain't necessarily have the degree on planning. You know, their experience is valuable. You know, so once the university started training their students to be organizers, you know, partners of the community, you know, then they can use those skills to also help facilitate the relationships with banks, facilitate relationships with the community organizations. I mean, it's one of the skills that I've been able to have, you know, in my career, you know, coming from a community organizing background, but also working in the urban planning space and now working in the real estate development space. You know, it's just broadening my perspective in order to facilitate all of these different ideas and stakeholders for a goal, whatever that goal is. But I can't come up with that goal myself. You know, I have ideas, you know, but those ideas don't mean nothing if the rest of the community doesn't buy into them.
Thanks, Denetrick. We just have a couple minutes left, and we have a lot of really excellent questions in the question and answer here, which we are not possibly going to get to. Folks have some really great questions about how we use the energy and momentum responsibly to help reconstruct Lake Street with business owners and current residents in mind. How do you avoid issues like displacement, where you might have folks who are more on the capitalist side saying, great, here's some cheap land, easy to pick up and resell for profit, right? I think we could probably talk about this topic for the entire rest of this day and continue to unpack all of these questions and still come out with a number of additional questions at the end that we'd want to follow up on. So I think I want to thank all of my fellow panelists today for sharing their thoughts and their knowledge. And clearly this is just the beginning of this conversation in the planning profession, in our region here, and obviously across our nation about how do we actually make real and lasting change in the way that we educate our planners and the way that our planners interact in their communities and the way our systems actually support them doing that work, being the advocate for the voice that isn't at the public hearing. That is what our planning profession says, that we should be representing the voice that isn't there. How do we actually do that in real practice and train up our planners to have the skills to actually have those relationships and understand and how to represent them appropriately? But I think there's also a lot of conversation that folks want to have around what does it mean to help rebuild in areas, and how do you do that with community? How does the community build the table? And how do planners support that table in helping to get that done and realize that vision with them? So, and we have 1 minute left before we close today, and I don't know if others wanted to leave with any parting thoughts in the less than 60 seconds we have remaining.
Just one, and I'll be brief. In a capitalist society like we live in, the financial institutions are unavoidably important, but we create the rules that they have to abide by, right? And so until the capitalist system changes, we have to be more attentive to the rules.
Thanks. That's a really good point. Fernando, did you want to say something?
Yes, I invite anyone in this conversation to email me and we can continue the conversation one-on-one. I just want to say thank you to all the panelists in the audience. and that cities have always been and will be sites of social change and also of social grassroots. That defines the city as much as capital accumulation defines the city. It's this dialectical process, if we want to get Marxist. Also, the way we do planning is actually an anomaly in the world. The American planning system and the comprehensive planning system that we have here regionally is really something really strange and unique when you think about how the world and people and experiences and cultures have done planning. So that begs for a self-critical awareness of both the limitations and how strange we are as an example. And with that, it opens up the imagination to other possibilities.
And I would just close with saying that, you know, in Minnesota, we've already decided to do planning differently once before, and it doesn't mean we can't do it again. I'm probably a little more optimistic than Ryan is about our ability to make systems change, and that's where I will continue to support and push for that type of work. So thank you all. Thank you all to our listeners today too, and thank you all for your comments and questions in the chat. And we will do our best to try to organize those and find some ways to provide at least either ongoing conversation or some responses where there were some simple, easier questions to answer. Some of your questions are a lot deeper and more philosophical than others. So thank you all, and thank you all for being a part of this really important conversation today.